Happy Pesach. Shabbat Shalom. Rabbi David Tuch says Pesach is not only about freedom from, it is about having our freedom, having the freedom to make the world a more sacred place by expanding God's presence in it. I'm going to say that one more time, especially in the times we find ourselves living in right now. He says Pesach is not only about freedom from, it is about our having the freedom to make the world a more sacred place by expanding God's presence in it. So let me say this again with that in mind. Happy Pesach. We are going to talk through the celebration of one of the oldest continually practiced rituals. The Passover Seder has been celebrated for over 3,000 years. This year, it was in Monday and Tuesday was the times for the Passover Seder. That's when people gathered around in their homes and in small groups to celebrate Passover. It is the retelling of a spectacular story of the deliverance of the Israelites from captivity. The Passover Seder celebrates the story of covenant, redemption, and freedom. Exodus 12:14 says, "This will be a day for you to remember," and we can see that here if you can see this card, "and celebrate as a festival to Adonai. From generation to generation, you are to celebrate it by a perpetual regulation." Perpetual regulation means a permanent enactment. So it's something that's to be done from generation to generation. He also declared that it was to be kept by a service, Exodus 12:25 says. And in Leviticus 23, God enumerated what he called my feasts. And then he enjoins their observance upon his people forever. So, how does this work? Sages have prescribed this Pesach, this word Pesach, which means jump over. This Pesach celebration is done in a certain sequence. And the word Seder means order. So the Pesach or Passover, jumping over, is done in a specific order. The Seder sequence is presented in the Haggadah, which means the telling of a story. A lot of times people have books that are the Haggadahs, and they read from the book. And that is the telling of the story of the Exodus. Although there are many variations in celebrating the Passover Seder, they are telling of the story of God's deliverance of his people in a prescribed order. So here's something that maybe you weren't aware of, and many of you are who've practiced with us the biblical festivals, but both the Jewish and the Gentile followers of Yeshua celebrated Passover. The Apostle Paul gave this recommendation concerning Passover in 1 Corinthians 5:8, which is, by the way, the New Testament. "So let us celebrate the Seder not with leftover chametz." Chametz means food with yeast. The chametz of wickedness and evil, which symbolizes hidden sin that grows and permeates into everything. Now, if you want to have some fun, say this word chametz with me. And it's the Hebrew word for yeast. It really clears the throat out nicely. And so chametz, it sort of symbolizes that sin is hidden and it grows and permeates into everything. But with matzah, that's bread without yeast, and we kind of can see what this looks like up here. That is the bread or matzah of purity and truth. So we see that Paul, who became a follower of Yeshua after Yeshua died and was resurrected, he celebrated the Seder and makes reference to the symbolism of the matzah. It is the Passover Seder that forms the primary background for understanding of the events of what is referred to as the Lord's Supper, which, funnily enough, the Western Church somehow talks about this as it's a new thing that Jesus made up, and they are carrying on the tradition of drinking juice and eating bread in their church buildings every Sunday or once a month, because they're doing this in remembrance of this tradition that Jesus made up. Again, for those of you who've been with this group for a while, one of the phrases we like to say is context, context, context. And we're getting ready to get into that in a new series, how to take scripture in its Hebrew and biblical context. This was the Passover that Yeshua, a Jew, and his Jewish disciples, also Jews, were following. They were celebrating the Passover at this time. So we're going to look at some familiar texts as they connect with their Jewish roots, and then not divide or separate them from their context. And first what we're going to do is we're going to do the tradition of the mother lighting the candles. These candles are a little bit different because these are the festival candles, the Passover candles, but the mother traditionally lights them, although men can as well. The mother usually says a prayer. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has preserved our lives so that we may celebrate your festival. As we kindle these festival lights, may the light of your presence overshadow us so that we may discern the significance of this celebration. So now I'm going to just tell the story of the Exodus. And most of us know it, but we need to be reminded of it, and obviously God knows that, which is why he has these festivals all throughout the year. We need points of time where we stop and we pause and we remember the story of deliverance or healing or salvation. So Israel had been enslaved. Now there's differences of opinions in how long they were enslaved in Egypt for. But let's say, I think one that's everyone's in agreement with is it's been over 200 years. They've been forced into increasingly more difficult and torturous labor for the splendor of the Pharaoh and his Egyptian monuments. They cried out to God for deliverance. The Lord had already anticipated their cry and had someone in place, Moshe, or as we say, Moses. With the help of his brother Aaron, he faced Pharaoh, the ruler of this kingdom that held God's people as slaves. And he makes this command, and we've heard it 1,000 times. Let my people go. Pharaoh would not. The result of Pharaoh's unrelenting decision were 10 plagues to pronounce that God pronounced to show Yahweh is Lord over all the earth. Interestingly, these 10 plagues directly counter the gods of the Egyptians. So if you have some free time and you want to do something really fun, you can do your own research here, and you can see that every one of the 10 plagues directly confront an Egyptian god. Because Yahweh was letting the world know, I am God over all the earth. Also, another interesting thing here was that the Nile, where the Jewish babies were thrown into to drown under Pharaoh's orders, was turned to blood. So there's a lot of connections there. In the final plague, all of the firstborn of Egypt would die as God passed through the land. As the night approached, every family of Israel was instructed to sacrifice a spotless lamb at the threshold of their homes. Then with a twig of plant called a hyssop, which kind of looks like this, it's where they made the stalks, they wrapped them, and they had some leaves at the end, and they sort of used it like a paintbrush. And what happened was they took this, they dipped it in the blood, and the blood was applied to the doorposts and the lintels of the house, if you can see this. It was on top and on the side of the doorway. God said, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Again, the Hebrew word being Pesach, which means jump over. So death would not come to their families. The encircling of the doors of their houses was a public demonstration of each family's trust and obedience in God and his word. They were really marking themselves as trusting in Yahweh and not aligning with Egypt. So think about this. This was a very counter-government kind of action. this taking of the pig's blood, which by the way was one of the Egyptian gods used in ceremonies as well, and marking their house. So everyone would see that these are people that stand with Yahweh and not the Egyptian Pharaoh, who he himself called a god. He referred to himself as a god. So the Jews were to remain inside the house, eating roasted lamb, consuming bitter herbs, and sharing in the bread of affliction. That was made very quickly, because after years of slavery, God would do a very quick work of deliverance. So they didn't have time to bake bread with yeast. They had to make it without yeast so that they could bake it quickly and go. They needed to bounce. So this resulted in Pharaoh's releasing the Israelites and ordering them to leave the land. He even gave them riches to take with them. He was so sick of them and their God and all the plagues, he said, take these riches, and they would later use these for the tabernacle. But like all oppression, when it has us, it does not want to let go. Like all things evil, it wants to stay oppressing us. The Pharaoh changes his mind, and he sends his army to bring the Israelites back after he had already released them and they already started to move. And as they stood at the Sea of Reeds, with their enemies approaching — by the way, this is the Sea of Reeds, it's mistranslation in the Red Sea, but that's another story. As they stand at the Sea of Reeds with their enemies approaching, Moshe says, stand firm and see the salvation of God. Suddenly, a powerful east wind begins to blow. There's a lot of imagery in the Bible about the east wind as well. Very important. It's also where the Messiah, the deliverance, will come one day. And that east wind clears a path of dry ground at the bottom of the sea. And we read in scriptures that it says a wall of water stood up on each side. This enabled the people to pass through the sea by walking on the dry lands. It was also an act symbolic of death, burial, and resurrection. When the Israelites crossed and the Egyptian army followed, the sea then came back together and swallowed up the Egyptian army so that they could not capture the Israelites and bring them back into slavery. They were set free once and for all from the Egyptians. This is the story that is remembered and celebrated on Passover. The Israelites were literally delivered by God from the Egyptians, but for those of us who are followers of Yeshua, we too were in bondage, and Yahweh took us out as well. So even if we are not Jewish, and this is not our cultural history, this is our spiritual history. So we too can connect with the story, not in replacing Israel, but in joining them in the celebration, because as it is often said in the Passover, we too were there. So let's look at some of the elements of a Passover Seder. First of all, I love all things biblical festivals because God, who designed us, knows that we're tactile people. And if you're like me, you learn many different ways. It's maybe not just auditory learning. You have to touch it. You have to see it. You have to taste it even. You have to feel it. You have to experience it. And so because God designed humans to be like that, that is the festival. That is the way festivals are celebrated. Very holistic, very tactile. Even children can say the story because they touch it and they smell it and they eat it and they see it and they sing it. Exodus 6 through 8 says, therefore, say to the people of Israel, I am Adonai. I will free you from the forced labor of the Egyptians, rescue you from their oppression, and redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgment. That concept of outstretched arm is the arm of strength to deliver us. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. This is the Lord saying this to Moshe. Then you will know that I am Adonai, your God, who freed you from the forced labor of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as your inheritance, for I am Adonai. Now, the first thing I want to talk about, and by the way, this is not in the same order as if we were having a Passover Seder together and eating of everything that it would go. But the first thing I want to talk about is the cups. The 4 cups come out of this text that I just read. The first of 4 cups that are drank at the Passover Seder with a blessing or a kiddush. And so the cup is filled with wine. I'm not going to drink this because if I drank this, I would be a little too happy, okay? So I'm going to wait until after, until we say Shabbat Shalom, and then get into it, and then get busy. But for now, this celebrates the Kiddush. 4 cups are spoken about. The cup of sanctification, the cup of deliverance, and deliverance has to do with the judgment and the plagues. And when they drink the cup for deliverance, they take their finger and they drip 10 drops for each plague. The cup of redemption and the cup of restoration. So there's 4 cups that are drank of wine. I go like this. 4 cups that are drank of wine. And that verse that we just read in Exodus talks about the 4 cups or the 4 types of deliverance. Now, Paul would write in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 and 26, by the way, for those who get tripped up and think that this is under the law or the Old Testament or only for Jews, where's 1 Corinthians found? Say it with me. In the New Testament. That's exactly right. 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 26 says, "For what I received from the Lord is just what I passed on to you." This is Paul saying this. That the Lord Yeshua, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And after he had made the bracha, that's the blessing. By the way, we read all of our scripture from the complete Jewish version. So if you're following along, you can look up that version with us. After he made the bracha, or the blessing, he broke it and he said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this as a memorial to me." Likewise, also the cup after the meal, saying, "This cup is the new covenant affected by my blood. Do this as often as you drink it as a memorial to me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes." So we see in the blood that was shed by Yeshua all 4 cups as well. Sanctification, deliverance, redemption, and restoration. We see that as well. All of the Passover elements have symbolic meaning and are eaten to experience it. Again, we relive it. Now this teaching tonight is going to be a little bit longer than normal, okay? Because I have some elements I want to go through, and that is what it is, okay? So first thing I want to talk about is karpas, okay? Karpas is the green vegetable, and this is dipped in salt water. We're using parsley. Many people use parsley. And dipping it in the salt water and eating it where they taste the salt reminds you, when you eat it, of the tears of the slaves. It also reminds us that the way of the transgressor is bitter, because Israel found themselves as slaves because they turned from God's laws, and he warned them that that would happen. So it reminds us of the consequences of sin, and turning from Yahweh will bring us sorrow and pain. Also, the salt in the sea that was crossed, and the tears of Yeshua in the garden as well as the drops of sweat that Yeshua experienced that turned to blood. One element that the sages added later is the roasted egg, or called beitzah. Say that with me, beitzah. And that is to remind Israel of their responsibility to bring an offering to the temple while it was still standing. Since it is not standing today, they cannot sacrifice or eat of it. The egg is also said to be a symbol of new life. Now, rabbis teach there are 3 essential elements in the Passover. 3 things that are the most important: Pesach, matzah, and maror. Yeshua also partook of these three essentials on the night of the Last Supper before his death. Yeshua said, I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. So another item on the Passover Seder plate is this bone. It's a lamb bone. It's called a zeroah. It's a roasted bone that symbolizes the Passover lamb that was killed so the firstborn Israelite may live, and the blood of the lamb that was put on the threshold of the door as a protection from death. We also celebrate and remember our Passover lamb, Yeshua. And by the way, we're going to talk about how Yeshua is the Passover lamb in our Sabbath Collective membership group teaching, which is next. If you'd like to become a member, that's a paid membership group. You can click on the sign up group and button and join us. So the other element, it's Pesach, it's matzah. The other element is matzah. Now, they didn't have time to bake bread with yeast as they would leave Egypt quickly. So matzah is the Hebrew term meaning sweet. And it's contrasted with the word for leavened bread, chametz, which means bitter. So matzah means sweet. Now, traditionally, matzah is put in this bag, which is called a unity bag, if you can see it. And this unity bag has three parts to it. Now, a lot of people say these three parts represent Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some people say other things. But the matzah is taken, there's a matzah in the three compartments. Matzah is taken from the middle compartment and broken in two. And then this afikoman, which is is half a piece, is hidden away. A child hides it, and later it's redeemed. And obviously we can make connections there too with Yeshua. So you will notice here on this matzah, in the process of baking this matzah, it was pierced in order to ensure that it didn't rise from incipient yeast. So in this process, there are brown stripes that you can see that are created along these pierced rows. So obviously, as we're making these connections with Jesus with matzah, we can make connections to Yeshua and the matzah stripes with no yeast or sin. So I'm going to do a mashup with some verses. Psalm 22:16, Zechariah 12:10, and Isaiah 53:5 says, they pierce my hands and my feet. They shall look on me whom they have pierced. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities, and by his stripes we are healed. The struggle for freedom is continuous. In every age, there are new elements that strive for mastery over the human spirit, enslaving men by binding them to their desires or to human systems of evil. Each generation is obligated to march towards freedom. The Hebrew word translated freedom is dynamic. It's not static. Freedom is a continuous action. We don't arrive at a once and done state of freedom. So in the Passover Seder, there is the removal of any yeast in the house. Again, yeast is symbolic here. Its meaning is what is focused on here is the sin, removing the sin, okay? It is called leaven and was used in making bread and wine. But it also has the power to infiltrate whatever it is in. Exodus 12:15 says, for 7 days the bread you eat must be made without yeast. On the first day of the festival, remove every trace of yeast. And the Lord himself said to his disciples, beware of the leaven, which is false doctrine. In addition, the Apostle Paul warns of leaven. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. So Paul was simply saying here that if sin goes unchecked, it gets into everything and permeates everything. So at this time in the Passover Seder, a sort of fun thing is that the children go around the house and find all the bread that their parents have hidden with yeast in it. They point to the father sweeps it up and takes it outside of the house. The sons also ask 4 questions as to the whys of the Passover. So now we get into another element, which is marar, or bitter herbs, which is usually horseradish. We eat the bitter herbs to remind us of the bitterness when we were slaves. So you take some marar and you put it on the matzah, okay? And by the way, this is horseradish, and you get a big old glob of it like this, okay? And this is a tactile, holistic experience of the bitterness. It makes you tear up. You eat this, and you feel the bitterness in your nose and your eyes water. I'm not going to do it. We dip a second time, but now we dip in the mixture of chorosa. Okay, and chorosa is a mixture of fruit, nuts, and wine. And it symbolizes the mixture of clay and straw that the Israelites used to make bricks. And then we eat that. Then we take it again. We do the same thing, only except this time we take the two pieces together and we make what's called a Hillel sandwich. This is the bitter and the sweet. And the tasting of the bitter and the sweet together reminds us that life has both. So these are the symbolic elements used in a Passover Seder to connect us to the story of redemption. This is the power of Passover that the followers of Yeshua, many years after his resurrection, celebrated. We should absolutely not allow this celebration that directly connects us with him as the Messiah, who died and was resurrected and delivered us, to be stolen and replaced by a rabbit and some chocolate. Festivals are a gift to us to remember the Lord's fulfillment of his provision, his power, and his promise of redemption. This is the lesson of history. This is the story of freedom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. To him who loved us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and has made us to be a kingdom of priests to serve God and Father, to him be the glory and power forever and ever. Amen. Happy Pesach, and see you Sabbath Collective members on the other side.